Good evening, First Baptist Church. How are y'all this morning? Oh my gosh. How are y'all this evening? Evidently, I've been asleep all day. Okay, if you would stand. We're going to worship our Heavenly Father tonight. We're going to start off with He Keeps Me Singing. And we have no lyrics up here. You should have lyric sheets in front of you. So there's no excuse not to sing. So sing it out with us. There's within my heart a melody. Jesus whispers sweet and low. Fear not, I am with thee. Peace be still. In all of God's ebb and flow. Jesus, 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 sweetest name I know. Fills my every longing. Keeps me singing as I go. All my life was wrecked by sin and strife. Discord filled my heart with pain. Jesus wept across the broken strings, stirred the slumbering chords again. Jesus, 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 sweetest name I know. Fills my every longing, keeps me singing as I go. Verse 5. Soon he's coming back to welcome me, far beyond the starry skies. I shall wing my flight to worlds unknown. I shall reign with him on high. Sing it out. Jesus, 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 sweetest name I know. Fills my every longing, keeps me singing as I go. Chorus again. Jesus, 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 sweetest name I know. Fills my every longing, keeps me singing as I go. Wow, y'all can read fast. I like it. All right, we're going to do Come Now Is the Time to Worship. We haven't done this one in a long time. I've started on Wednesday nights. We always do a hymn. Sometimes we do two hymns, but I've started looking into songs that we used to do back in the day. Makes me feel young again. No, it doesn't really. But so we're going to start doing some throwbacks. So we're going to do Come Now Is the Time to Worship tonight. So y'all sing that out. Come, now is the time to the time to give your heart. Come, just as you are to worship. Come, just as you are before your God. Come. One day every tongue will confess you are God. One day every knee will bow. Still the greatest treasure remains for those who gladly choose you now. Come, now is the time to worship. Come, now is the time to give your heart. Come, just as you are to worship. Come, just as you are before your God. Come, y'all sing this out. One day every tongue will confess you are God. One day every knee will bow. Still the greatest treasure remains for those who gladly choose you now. Oh, one day every tongue will confess you are God. may be seated.
All right, thank you, ladies and men. Open your Bibles tonight to Judges chapter 19. Judges chapter 19. Well, I have good news and bad news tonight. If you remember, last week we looked at what was just an awful time in the history of the Old Testament, because there's no king, and immediately when it says that, it all goes south. And there's this guy that was living in a house. His mom apparently was pretty wealthy. He's a grown man, and mom had a bunch of money, and he stole his mother's money. Mom didn't know it was him, so she put a curse on whoever stole her money. And then he stepped forward and said, okay, I actually took it, Mom. She said, okay, never mind with the curse. And she was so happy that the curse didn't kill him that she donated a big portion of the money to make an idol to be put together with all the rest of his idols that were cast idols and carved idols. That is, there were metal idols and wood idols, along with an ephod, because they were Israelites. You know, you want to mix in a little bit of Judaism in with all of this idolatry. And so he had all of these idols set up along with the ephod. And then a Levite happened to come through town from the priestly tribe, and so he hired this Levite to be his own private preacher. And so the Levite, who was obviously messed up as well, should have immediately said, get rid of all these idols. But he didn't. He was in charge of the idols, and so that's how it worked. And then in the end, an entire army of Israelites came to the house, not because they were incensed that there was idolatry going on and they wanted to destroy the idols. No, they wanted to steal the idols because they wanted to use them themselves. So they went in, stole the idols, and the Levite, they offered him a better pay package, and so the private preacher went with them. He said, that's a good idea, let's go. And so they took off. So it was a mess. It was just awful. And I told you that was the worst chapter in the Bible. That I was wrong. And that's the bad news. It is horrible tonight. I'll tell you, if you're watching online, the good news is it's not boring, okay? That's the good news. You won't be bored. The bad news is, for example, of the 12 tribes, one of the 12 tribes is almost going to be completely eradicated tonight, almost completely extinct by the time the night's over. And that's not even the worst thing that happens in the chapter, okay? All right, chapter 19. Now, chapters 19, 20, and 21 all go together as one cohesive story. If we can get through them all tonight, I will. If we can't, then I will take it up next week. Judges chapter 19. So I'm going to read as efficiently as I can. Judges 19, verse 1. In those days, Israel had no king. And again, that's a precursor to means whatever we're about to say is bad. There's nobody in charge. Now, Levite, this is a different Levite, who lived in a remote area in the hill country of Ephraim, took a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah. But she was unfaithful to him. She left him and went back to her father's house in Bethlehem in Judah. After she had been there 4 months, her husband went to her to persuade her to return. He had with him his servant and 2 donkeys. She took him into her father's house, and when her father saw him, he gladly welcomed him. His father-in-law, the girl's father, prevailed on him to stay, so he remained with them 3 days, eating and drinking and sleeping there. On the 4th day, they got up early as he prepared to leave, but the girl's father said to his son-in-law, refresh yourself with something to eat, then you can go. So the 2 of them sat down to eat and drink together. And that wasn't Coca-Cola. Every time they sit down and have, it says eating and drinking in verse 4, and then again in verse 5. And so there's a lot of eating and a lot of drinking. Verse 6, a lot of eating and a lot of drinking going on. Afterward, the girl's father said, please stay tonight and enjoy yourself. What does enjoy yourself mean? More drinking. That's right. Verse 7. And when the man got up to go, his father-in-law persuaded him. So he stayed there that night. On the morning of the 5th day, when he rose to go, the girl's father said, refresh yourself. What does that mean? More drinking. Wait till afternoon. They're drinking buddies. So the 2 of them ate together. Then when the man with his concubine and his servant got up to leave, His father-in-law, the girl's father, said, "Now look, it's almost evening. Spend the night here. I wonder how many years this could go on. Spend the night here. The day is nearly over. Stay and enjoy yourself. Early tomorrow morning you can get up and be on your way home." But unwilling to stay another night, the man left and went toward Jebus, that is Jerusalem, with his 2 saddled donkeys and his concubine. Wow. Well, that's quite a way to start a story. It's all going to go south, as you probably already know. And my commentary tonight is from the Bible Exposition Commentary and probably a little bit from the NIV commentary as well. If you thought that the Levite, Jonathan, from chapter 17, 18, was a reprobate, then you probably conclude that this unnamed Levite was an absolute scoundrel of the basest sort. He spent most of his time partying. He walked in darkness and jeopardized his life and the lives of those with him. He treated his concubine in the most shocking manner while she was alive and after she was dead, and what he did to her precipitated a civil war in Israel. And that's how the story begins. By the way, did you notice he's married to her, but she's not called his wife, she's called his concubine. Why? Does anybody know? The first woman that he married is likely called his wife. Again, there's no king, there's nobody enforcing any law, and so anybody can do what they want. And when they did whatever they want, they ended up with a lot of wives, or one wife and a lot of concubines. A concubine was a lawful wife who was guaranteed only food, clothing, and marital privileges. Any children she bore would be considered legitimate, but because of her second-class status, they wouldn't necessarily share the family inheritance. If a man's wife was barren, he sometimes took a concubine so he could establish a family. Though the law controlled concubinage, the Lord did not approve of or encourage it. Yet you will find several Old Testament men who had concubines, including Abraham, Jacob, Gideon, Saul, David, and Solomon. Solomon had 700 wives and 300 concubines. This particular concubine was unfaithful to her husband and fled to her father's house in Bethlehem for protection. The longer she was gone, the more her husband missed her. That sounds sweet so far. So he traveled to Bethlehem, forgave her, and was reconciled. He and his father-in-law discovered they enjoyed each other's company and spent 5 days eating, drinking, and making merry. Little did the Levite realize that he really had nothing to be happy about because tragedy was stalking his marriage. When his nation was so far from God, how could this Levite, he was a Levite, a minister, a priest, how could this Levite waste his time eating and drinking and making merry? There was not only no king, but there was no spiritual leadership in the nation either. Verse 11, when they were near Jebus, or Jerusalem, and the day was almost gone, the servant said to his master, "Come, let's stop at this city of the Jebusites and spend the night." His master replied, "No, we won't go into an alien city," because Jerusalem was not under Jewish control yet, whose people are not Israelites. "We will go to Gibeah," he added. "Come, let's try to reach Gibeah or Ramah and spend the night in one of those places." So they went on, and the sun set as they neared Gibeah in Benjamin. There they stopped to spend the night. So again, this is supposed to be a nice Jewish town. They went and sat in the city square, but no one took them into his home for the night. That evening, an old man from the hill country of Ephraim, who was living in Gibeah, the men of the place were Benjamites. So he's not a Benjamite, he's an Ephraimite, but he's living there, came in from his work in the fields. When he looked and saw the traveler in the city square, the old man asked, "Where are you going? Where did you come from?" He answered, "Well, we're on our way from Bethlehem in Judah to a remote area in the hill country of Ephraim where I live. I've been to Bethlehem in Judah, and now I'm going to the house of the Lord. No one has," that's at Bethel, "no one has taken me into their house. We have both straw and fodder for our donkeys and bread and wine for ourselves and your servants, your maidservant, and the young man with us. We don't need anything." "You're welcome at my house," the old man said. "Let me supply whatever you need. Only don't spend the night in the square." So he took him into his house and fed his donkeys. After they had washed their feet, they had something to eat and drink. Sounds good so far. Hospitality is one of the sacred laws of the East, and no stranger was to be neglected. But only one man in the city showed any concern, and he was an Ephraimite. He not only took them into his home, but also used his own provisions to feed them and their animals. God's people are commanded to practice hospitality. 1 Timothy chapter 3, Titus 1:8. It's one of the qualifications for a pastor. And for believers, in Hebrews chapter 13 says, do not forget to entertain strangers, for by doing so, some people have entertained angels without knowing it. We're supposed to be hospitable to other people. And so this man took them in. This is where it all goes bad. By the way, does this start to sound a little bit like another story? Okay, let's look in the next verse. While they were enjoying themselves, what do you think that is? More drinking. Woo-hoo. Some of the wicked men of the city surrounded the house. Pounding on the door, they shouted to the old man who owned the house, bring out the man who came to your house so we can have sex with him. The owner of the house went outside and said to them, no, my friends, don't be so vile. Since this man is my guest, don't do this disgraceful thing. Now, let me stop right there just a second. Now, does it sound familiar? Sounds like Sodom. And which is interesting that this guy says, this is an abomination to God. It's against the law. You shouldn't do it. What he said was, since this man is my guest, don't do it. So you don't know him, so I guess you shouldn't do it for that reason. And then he says, again, by the way, I just read it. I don't write it. Verse 24, look, here's my virgin daughter and his concubine. I will bring them out to you now, and you can use them and do whatever you wish, but to this man, don't do such a disgraceful thing. Well, that kind of sounds like a disgraceful thing to the women too, does it not? But the men would not listen to him, so the man took his concubine and sent her outside to them. Now, let me say that again. The men would not listen to him. In other words, they said what? No deal. We don't want the women, we want the man. In response, he went ahead and pushed the wife out the door anyway. And they raped her and abused her throughout the night, and at dawn they let her go. At daybreak, the woman went back to the house where her master was staying, fell down at the door, and lay there until daylight. And by the way, she's dead. Gibeah had become like Sodom. And again, this is an Israelite town. A city so wicked that God had wiped it out, that is Sodom, off of the face of the earth in Genesis 19. The men of the city were indulging in immoral practices that were contrary to nature and the laws of God from Leviticus chapter 18 and verse 20, as well as Romans chapter 1, verse 24. Verse 27, when her master got up in the morning and opened the door of the house and stepped out to continue on his way, there lay his concubine, fallen in the doorway of the house with her hands on the threshold. He said to her, get up, let's go. But there was no answer. Then the man put her on his donkey and set out for home. And again, she's deceased at this point. Like Lot in Sodom, the host offered them his daughter, which shows the low estimate some men in that day had on women and of sexual purity. How a father could offer his own daughter as a sacrifice to the lusts of a mob is difficult to understand. Yet many parents today allow their sons and daughters' minds and hearts to be violated by what they see and hear in movies, television, online, and everywhere else. Chastity of mind and heart is essential for chastity of the body. Since the Levite was afraid the mob would kill him, he pacified them by giving them his concubine, and she had to endure gang rape the whole night. Our hearts revolt at the thought of a man so insensitive to the feelings of a human being made in the image of God, so indifferent to the sanctity of sex and the responsibility of marriage, and so unconcerned about the laws of God that he would sacrifice his wife to save his own skin. He didn't even try. He didn't take a sword and go out and try to fight them or a club or anything. He just pushed her out the door. And this is a Levite. Was he punishing her for being unfaithful to him? If so, the punishment was far greater than the sin. But it gets worse. Not only did the Levite surrender his wife to the perverted appetites of an ungodly mob, but also he was able to lie down and go to sleep while they were abusing her in the street. He didn't seem that concerned at all. How callous can a man become? And how naive was he to expect that she would be alive the next morning? Verse 29, when he reached home, he took a knife and cut up his concubine limb by limb into 12 parts and sent them into all the areas of Israel. Everyone who saw it said, such a thing has never been seen or done, not since the day the Israelites came up out of Egypt. Think about it. Consider it. Tell us what to do. So finding her dead on the doorstep, but not feeling guilty about it, because he's not under conviction himself that he did anything wrong. He's blaming the men of the city. As a result, he put her corpse on one of the donkeys and made his way home. Then he did a despicable thing. He desecrated and mutilated her corpse by cutting it into 12 parts and sending one part to each of the 12 tribes of Israel. Of course, he wanted to mobilize the support of the tribes and punish the men of Gibeah who had killed his wife. But in fact, he was the one who had let them kill her in the first place. Surely there were other ways to call attention to Gibeah's crime. So he does one atrocity, and then he commits a second atrocity after that, after she's dead. So I told you, that's awful. Is that not awful? The good news is, and there is a little good news, it does succeed in mobilizing the nation against the men of Gibeah, all except for one tribe. Look at Judges chapter 20, verse 1. Then all the Israelites from Dan to Beersheba and from the land of Gilead came out as one man and assembled before the Lord in Mizpah. The leaders of all the people of the tribes of Israel took their places in the assembly of the people of God, 400,000 soldiers armed with swords. The Benjamites heard that the Israelites had gone up to Mizpah. Then the Israelites said, tell us how this awful thing happened. So it did shock them when they got their respective body part in the mail. The FedEx driver showed up, and that's what they got. And so they're all stunned, and so it does mobilize them. It did at least do that. Verse 4, so the Levite, the husband of the murdered woman, said, I and my concubine came to Gibeah and Benjamin to spend the night. During the night, the men of Gibeah came after me and surrounded the house, intending to kill me. They raped my concubine, and she died. Now, he left out a few little details there about him pushing her out the door. I took my concubine, cut her into pieces, and sent one piece to each region of Israel's inheritance because they committed this lewd and disgraceful act in Israel. Now, all of you Israelites, speak up and give your verdict. All the people rose as one man, saying, none of us will go home. No, not one of us will return to his house. But now this is what we'll do to Gibeah. We'll go up against it as the lot directs. We'll take 10 men out of every 100 from all the tribes of Israel, and 100 from 1,000, and 1,000 from 10,000 to get provisions for the army. Then, when the army arrives at Gibeah and Benjamin, it can give them what they deserve for all this vileness done in Israel. So all the men of Israel got together and united as one man against the city. So the Levites' gruesome announcement produced the results that he wanted. Leaders and soldiers from the entire nation, except for Benjamin, and one other place called Jabesh Gilead, and we'll get to that in a minute, came together at Mizpah to determine what to do. After hearing the indictment, the people of Israel delivered the verdict and made the vow. The verdict was that the men of Gibeah were guilty and should be handed over to the authorities to be slain. And that's what they were going to do, is slaughter them all. The vow was that none of the tribes represented would give their daughters in marriage to the men of Benjamin. And we'll see this in a moment. Look with me in verse 12. The tribes of Israel sent men throughout the tribe of Benjamin, saying, what about this awful crime that was committed among you? Now surrender those wicked men of Gibeah so that we may put them to death and purge the evil from Israel. Of course, what should have happened, this is the tribe of Benjamin. What should have happened is the men of Benjamin should have been just as shocked and appalled. They should have gone into the town, drugged those men out, and brought them to judgment. Instead, they decided to protect them. But the Benjamites would not listen to their fellow Israelites. Verse 14, from their towns they came together at Gibeah to fight against the Israelites. At once the Benjamites mobilized 26,000 swordsmen from their towns, in addition to 700 chosen men from those living in Gibeah. Among all these soldiers were 700 chosen men who were left-handed, each of whom could sling a stone at a hair and not miss. Well, that's just bragging. That means they were really good with a slingshot. Verse 17, Israel, apart from Benjamin, mustered 400,000 swordsmen, all of them fighting men. Now, I'm not a military strategist, but this is pretty lopsided, is it not? You got on one side, you've got all the other 11 tribes with 400,000 men, and then the Benjamites who have 26,000 swordsmen, and then 700 slingshot guys. Some people have interpreted the stubbornness of Benjamin as an act of patriotism. They were only trying to protect their own citizens, but their refusal to cooperate was definitely an act of rebellion against God. When sin isn't exposed, confessed, and punished, it pollutes society and defiles the land. The wicked men of Gibeah were like a cancerous tumor in the body that had to be cut out. Your glorying is not good. This is from 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 6. This is Paul speaking. He says, your glorying is not good. Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump, or ruins the whole lump? The result, the tribe of Benjamin declared war on the rest of the tribes of Israel. The 11 tribes had 400,000 men, while the Benjamites had 26,000 swordsmen and 700 who were experts with the slingshot. But in spite of the terrible odds, it was brother fighting against brother, and I think that's important for us to know. All right, any comments or questions so far? All right, the war is about to begin. Verse 18, the Israelites went up to Bethel and inquired of God. This is the first time in chapters that God even comes into this at all. I'm amazed and impressed that they actually brought God into this. This is not the Benjamites, by the way. This is the other guys, the rest of the Israelites. They said, who of us shall go first to fight against the Benjamites? The Lord replied, Judah shall go first. The next morning, the Israelites got up and pitched camp near Gibeah. The men of Israel went out to fight the Benjamites and took up battle positions against them in Gibeah. The Benjamites came out of Gibeah and cut down 22,000 Israelites on the battlefield that day. But the men of Israel encouraged one another and again took up their positions where they had stationed them the first day. The Israelites went up and wept before the Lord until evening. And they inquired of the Lord, they said, shall we go up again to battle against the Benjamites, our brothers? The Lord answered, go up against them. So they went out one day and got whipped. So they went back to God and said, should we do this again? He says, okay, yeah, do it again. Verse 24, then the Israelites drew near to Benjamin the second day. This time when the Benjamites came out from Gibeah to oppose them, they cut down another 18,000 Israelites, all of them armed with swords. Then the Israelites, all the people, went up to Bethel, and there they sat weeping before the Lord. They fasted that day until evening and presented burnt offerings and fellowship offerings to the Lord. And the Israelites inquired of the Lord. In those days, the ark of the covenant of God was there with Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, ministering before it. They asked, shall we go up again to battle with Benjamin, our brother, or not? The Lord responded, go, for tomorrow I will give them into your hands. Then Israel set an ambush around Gibeah. They went up against the Benjamites on the third day and took up positions against Gibeah as they had done before. The Benjamites came out to meet them and were drawn away from the city. They began to inflict casualties on the Israelites as before, so that about 30 men fell in the open field and on the roads, and the one leading to Bethel and the other to Gibeah. While the Benjamites were saying, we are defeating them as before, the Israelites were saying, let's retreat and draw them away from the city to the roads. All the men of Israel moved from their places and took their positions at Baal Tamar, and the Israelite ambush charged out of its place on the west of Gibeah. Then 10,000 of Israel's finest men made a frontal attack on Gibeah. The fighting was so heavy that the Benjamites did not realize how near disaster was. The Lord defeated Benjamin before Israel, and on that day the Israelites struck down 25,100 Benjamites, all armed with swords. Then the Benjamites saw that they were beaten. Now the men of Israel had given way before Benjamin because they relied on the ambush they had set for near Gibeah. The men who had been in ambush made a sudden dash for Gibeah, spread out, and put the whole city to the sword. The men of Israel had arranged with the ambush that they should send up a great cloud of smoke from the city, and then the men of Israel would turn on the battle. So this is the strategy. The Benjamites had begun to inflict casualties on the men of Israel, about 30, and they said, "We're defeating them as in the first battle." But when the column of smoke began to rise from the city, the Benjamites turned and saw the smoke of the whole city going up into the sky. That's when they realized they'd been had. They'd been surrounded. So the representatives of the 11 tribes went to the tabernacle at Shiloh, that's where the ark was, and sought the mind of God. God gave them permission to do battle, with the tribe of Judah leading the attack. The first day, God allowed Benjamites to win and kill 22,000 Israelite soldiers. Don't you find that interesting? Like God said, okay, send out Judah, and then the Judah tribe gets slaughtered, 22,000 of them. The 11 tribes wept before God and sought his will. Note that what was called the children of Benjamin in Judges 20:18 becomes Benjamin my brother in verse 23. Did y'all catch that? Now they're calling them brothers. Perhaps this was one reason why God permitted the Israelites to lose the first battle. It gave them an opportunity to reflect on the fact that they were fighting their own flesh and blood. But on the second day of the war, Benjamin won again, this time killing 18,000 men. And so the situation was grim. The 11 tribes again sought the face of God, this time with fasting and sacrifices along with their tears. And I give them credit for this. After losing 2 days in a row, they didn't give up. They didn't say, forget God. We've gone to him twice. Twice he said, go get them. And we lost twice. We're not going to go back a third time, but they do. Instead, they do go back to God. With fasting and weeping and humility, they go before God. And it may be that God has now brought them to this place of humility where he's now going to give them success. He assured them that this time they would have victory. So verse 41, then the men of Israel turned on them, and the men of Benjamin were terrified because they realized that disaster had come upon them. So they fled before the Israelites in the direction of the desert, but they could not escape the battle. And the men of Israel who came out of the towns cut them down there. They surrounded the Benjamites, chased them, and easily overran them in the vicinity of Gibeah in the east. 18,000 Benjamites fell, all of them valiant fighters. As they turned and fled toward the desert of the rock of Rimmon, the Israelites cut down 5,000 men along the roads. They kept pressing after the Benjamites as far as Gidom, and struck down 2,000 more. On that day, 25,000 Benjamite swordsmen fell, all of them valiant fighters. But 600 men turned and fled into the desert to the rock of Rimmon, where they stayed 4 months. The men of Israel went back to Benjamin, put all the towns to the sword, including the animals and everything else they found. All the towns they came across, they set on fire. So here's what happened. They wiped out the Benjamites. They killed all everybody in all the towns, all the elderly that were left, the elderly men, all of the women, all of the wives, all of the children, everybody got wiped out. The only people in existence at this point in the tribe of Benjamin was how many people? 600 men who are living in this rock, which is kind of a natural type rock fortress that was easy to defend. And so that's where they are for 4 months. The 4 months is interesting because it does give the other 11 tribes time to reflect on what has happened. At the first census after the exodus from Egypt, there were 35,400 men of war in Benjamin. And this increased to 45,000 by the time of the second census. So during this 3-day war, the Benjamites were left with only 600 men stranded in the rock of Rimmon. So all but 600 are gone. All right, any comments or questions? Okay, I think we're going to finish. It does get, I say it gets better. I'm not sure. It gets better for the Benjamites. It gets more bizarre. What you're about to hear is bizarre. Again, I'm just going to read it to you. We'll have a few words at the end. Chapter 21. The men of Israel, and it's hard to imagine that it's going to get more bizarre than what is already done, but it is. The men of Israel had taken an oath at Mizpah, not one of us will give our daughter into marriage to a Benjamite. The people went to Bethel, where they sat before God until evening, raising their voices and weeping bitterly. "O Lord, the God of Israel," they cried, "why has this happened to Israel? Why should one tribe be missing from Israel today?" So once their anger cooled off, the 11 tribes realized that they had just about eliminated one of the 12 tribes from the nation of Israel. And this made them weep. They offered sacrifices to God, but there's no record that the people actually humbled themselves or confessed their sins or sought the help of the Lord. Previously, the Lord had revealed his will to them, but there's no evidence that they received his word after the battle was over. Verse 4, so early the next day, the people built an altar and presented burnt offerings and fellowship offerings. Then the Israelites asked, "Who from all the tribes of Israel has failed to assemble before the Lord?" For they had taken a solemn oath that anyone who failed to assemble before the Lord at Mizpah should certainly be put to death. Now here's what happened. They made this vow that they weren't going to give any of their daughters to the Benjamites as wives. And then they wiped out all their wives and their children and their families. And because they've made a vow that their daughters can't be married to the Benjamites, that means these 600 men are just going to end up dying without wives, and then that ends the tribe of Benjamin. Well, the other 11 tribes, they start to feel bad about that and thought, man, we don't want the tribe to die altogether. We would give them our daughters, but we made this vow, so we got to find some women for them. And so they asked the question, you know, we said that if there's anybody that doesn't show up for battle, then we're going to go get them. And so they do that. So verse 6, now the Israelites grieved for the brothers, the Benjamites. Today that one tribe is cut off from Israel, they said, how can we provide wives for those who are left, since we have taken an oath by the Lord not to give them any of our daughters in marriage? Then they asked, which one of the tribes of Israel failed to assemble before the Lord at Mizpah? They discovered that no one from Jabesh Gilead had come to the camp for the assembly. And I don't know if they didn't get a body part, or, you know, they didn't check their Facebook page or what happened, but they didn't show up. They were no-show. Verse 9, for when they counted the people, they found that none of the people of Jabesh Gilead were there. So the assembly sent 12,000 fighting men with instructions to go to Jabesh Gilead and put to the sword those living there, including the women and children. This is what you're to do, they said. Kill every male and every woman who's not a virgin. They found among the people living in Jabesh Gilead 400 young women who had never slept with a man, and they took them to the camp at Shiloh in Canaan. So they got 400 girls that can marry or be married to these Benjamites. How many Benjamites are there? 600. So that leaves 200 of them just completely out of luck. So they come out with a different scheme. So in other words, since they had made this vow, they just went and wiped out these people and stole their daughters, and there goes 400. That solves 400. And so now they got to come up with an idea for 200 more. So the Israelites solved the problem by killing more of their own people. Nobody had come to the war from Jabesh Gilead, so it meant two things. They hadn't participated in the oath, and the city deserved to be punished, or it's possible that when the 12 parts of the concubine's body were sent throughout Israel, a warning was issued that any tribe or city that didn't respond and help fight Benjamin would be treated the same way. And if they got the message, they just didn't go, or whatever happened. Verse 13, then the whole assembly sent an offer of peace to Benjamites at the rock of Rimmon. So the Benjamites returned at that time and were given the women of Jabesh Gilead who had been spared, but there was not enough for all of them. The people grieved for Benjamin because the Lord had made a gap in the tribes of Israel. And the elders of the assembly said, with the women of Benjamin destroyed, how shall we provide wives for the men who are left, for the other 200? The Benjamite survivors must have heirs, they said, so that a tribe of Israel will not be wiped out. We can't give them our daughters as wives since we Israelites have taken this oath. Cursed be anyone who gives a wife to a Benjamite. Apparently, they don't think they can take their oath back. Verse 19, but look, there, oh, good grief. There is the annual festival of the Lord in Shiloh to the north of Bethel, and these are Israelites, and east of the road that goes from Bethel to Shechem, and to the south of Lamona. So they instructed the Benjamites, saying, go, these are the 200 that's left that without wives, go and hide in the vineyards and watch. When the girls of Shiloh come out to join in the dancing, then rush from the vineyards, and each one of you seize a wife from the girls of Shiloh and go to the land of Benjamin. When their fathers or brothers complain to us, we will say to them, do us a kindness by helping them, because we did not get wives for them during the war, and you are innocent since you did not give your daughters to them. So that's what the Benjamites did. While the girls were dancing, each man cut one and carried her off to be his wife. Then they returned to their inheritance and rebuilt the towns and settled them. At that time, the Israelites left that place and went home to their tribes and clans, each to his own inheritance. So the elders held another meeting to discuss how they could provide the 200. Virgins from the tribes participated in this feast at Shiloh. So they told them, go hide in the vines and just go grab you one. And so that's what they did. Now, these are the very daughters that they had vowed not to give them. But here's the semantics. They didn't give them. The Benjamites took them. And they just didn't stop it. Yeah, it sounds like politicians. Anyway, thus the 600 men got their brides, the 11 tribes kept their vow, the citizens of Gibeah were punished, the tribe of Benjamin was taught a lesson, and the 12 tribes of Israel were saved. The 600 men of Benjamin with their brides returned to their inheritance, cleaned up the debris, repaired the cities, and started life all over again. But all of this carnage and destruction happened because one Levite did not have the courage to stand up for what was right and treat his concubine honorably. Once again, as with Jonathan, Micah, and the Danites, the problem started in the home. As goes the home, so goes the nation. And then the last verse, verse 25. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as he saw fit. Well, that's the book of Judges. Thank goodness that's over. So it gets better next week, okay? We're going to move on. Any questions or comments about these 3 chapters? Yes? Yes. Yes, that's a very good observation. It did look like both theological chaos and just organizational chaos. There's nobody in charge of anything at this point. Yeah. Notice there's really no man's name is mentioned as leading the people. The Levite that started all of this, did you notice? At no time in the chapter is his name ever mentioned. Now, the previous Levite from last week, his name was mentioned. Was it Jonathan? But this Levite, they don't even give him a name. There's nobody in charge of anything, and it's a mess. Yeah. Any other observation? It's an interesting thought. Any other comments or questions? Okay, now I told my staff this afternoon, I said, I can talk about the home, but other than that, there's not a lot of really good practical explanation or application to a guy cutting up his concubine and the whole nation going to war with each other, except there are problems in the home. It does also show, because there was such a close correlation to the wickedness of Sodom, that it is astonishing that God allowed any of the nation to continue to exist at all. It's just very wicked. All right, any other comments?
The sad thing is they never needed a human king. They had a king.
Yeah, that's right. They had no king because they didn't need a king, but they obviously needed leadership, and they weren't submitting to God. I'll give them credit for this. Tonight, the Israelites, the 11 tribes, did go to God once, twice, even 3 times to seek the will of God. They didn't bow down to an idol. They didn't go to a medium or anything like that. They did go to the right place they were supposed to go, at Shiloh, I believe, and they submitted to God. They listened to God. It doesn't explain how they received the word from God, but God made it clear to them that he wanted them to go out and fight. And they did what they were told to do.
But once they got the victory, they never went back.
Yeah, that's the other perplexing thing. Yes. So.
It shows once you reject a set of laws, you reject God, then you have to just make it up on your own, and it doesn't make sense to anyone else except maybe in your own mind.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like they're all shooting from the hip because they don't know the law, because all of this could have been prevented had they simply been obeying the law. They had the law of Moses. They had the Levitical code. They had prohibitions against all of this. Had they simply obeyed that, none of this would have happened.
Some people knew the law. The old man from Ephraim knew it enough to know about the hospitality.
Oh, that's right.
Doing what the men of
Yeah.
Gideon were doing wasn't right.
Yeah. And sadly, the old man from Ephraim, he said he knew the law. He knew the law of hospitality, is what he's saying, and you're right. But unfortunately, once he got him into the house, he then immediately bargained with the men of the city. This is the old man, saying, here, you can have my virgin daughter, and you can have his concubine. How about that? And so he's not that good of a guy either, so it's just a big mess. All right, next week, I promise it gets better. Let's take a look at our prayer sheet for the week as we conclude our Bible study time.